context of what we're talking about. So this is me. I have actually been on an advisory committee for the FDA in the past. Recently, I completed a term with the NIH doing the regulatory assessments for the TABA needs assessment for the CBER program. This is my executive staff. With any luck, they stay asleep during this presentation and the mailman doesn't come. So for the regulatory 101, FDA has a risk-based classification system for medical devices. This ranges anywhere from class 1 that make up 45 to 50% of the market that are low risk devices like Band-Aids without ointment, handheld surgical instruments. Class 2 devices make up another 40 to 45%. These are moderate risk: infusion pumps, powered wheelchairs, everybody's favorite right now, surgical masks. Class 3 make up another 5 to 10% of the market. These are high risk, implantable, life supporting, life sustaining. And then there's still a handful of misfit toys that are unclassified, that are either pre-amendment or the FDA just hasn't figured out what to do with them yet. But regardless, every level of device has a set of controls that go with it. So you can see even a class 1 510K exempt device, and a 510K is a type of submission that is common for the low to moderate risk devices, are exempt from a lot of things. And there is a subset that's still exempt from good manufacturing practices, but no matter what, every set of devices has a level of what's called general controls. And we'll talk about what those are in a minute. So then class 2 devices, most of these require a 510K, but there are a subset that are exempt from a 510K. But there is a subset that requires not only a 510K, but a special control like a guidance document, particular labeling, post-market follow-up, where for the class 3 PMAs or pre-market approval, this submission is a very lengthy submission. It requires a lot of clinical data. In most cases, these are going to require this type of submission, but there is a subset that is exempt from a PMA submission and requires a 510K. Then this unclassified set of devices are functionally treated like class 2 devices and they require a 510K. So long story short, no matter what your classification is, there is a whole combination of requirements, exemptions, and clinical data and types of submissions or lack thereof that could be required. So it can be really difficult to interpret and correctly apply what set of controls applies to you. And so I see companies a lot especially when they pitch, that they and the investors are all excited, thinking that they hit the exemption jackpot, that we're a class 1, we're 510K exempt, and we're GMP exempt. But no matter what, you still have to have an establishment registration, which is a year-over-year fee, a device listing, and a basic quality management system that includes complaints and quality records. So there will always be a set of requirements and cost associated with commercializing a medical device. And some examples of the way pathways can differ and requirements can differ is based off your claims and intended use. So let's pretend we have got a startup that's focuses on bruxism, which is a condition where you grind or clench your teeth. You can be awake or at sleep, but it's primarily a sleep-related movement disorder. And let's say this company, they have a couple of different applications. They have a headband that you wear that can that has the ability to send you biofeedback. They have an app where the user can monitor their clenching behavior. They also have a plan configuration where the device can send data to a clinician for the purpose of diagnosing bruxism. So this product can be a little like choose your own adventure. It could be a little bit like just taking a trip to the fridge, where if you keep the right boundaries around the claims and you say it's for lay use, it's for general wellness with people with bruxism to help monitor their bruxism. But you say it in this situation, you can't say that it provides biofeedback. It just helps you monitor the behavior. Whereas it could be a walk in the park because the FDA actually regulates devices that have biofeedback under product code HCC. Now, this can still be a little bit simpler than a normal class 2 device because HCC is 510K exempt if it's for prescription use by a professional. So while there are going to be a good bit more requirements than if you say it's for general wellness, you're not having to go through that rigor of the formal submission to the FDA. But what if we want to say that it's no prescription, that this is for lay use? Well, the regulation is very specific that this is for prescription use. So once you exceed the requirement specified in the exemption description in the regulations, then you have to do at least a 510K, but perhaps a de novo, depending on what that indication or technology change is that you made compared to how it's described in the regulation. So another thing that you have to consider is the regulatory strategy and that leap that you take. Perhaps the device that you're interested in has the basic features of a well-known device, and it's combining it with a new feature or two or indication or two. So here you need to think about what is the best path to commercialization. Perhaps you start with that baseline device and you do what you can in the scope of the 510K. Perhaps certain feature changes could be a special 510K. And then you can do those exclusive features that are going to require a de novo in a separate step. Oftentimes, taking this small stepwise approach can actually speed your time to market, even if your first iteration isn't the device that you're intending on primarily commercializing. So if you can get something out there, you can start making some level of money that can fund your subsequent development. And then also an advantage from a regulatory perspective is that by the time you get to de novo, the FDA has already seen and cleared iteration.
Uh-oh, Michelle. I think she froze up.
Cleared us in this other area. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, Michelle, you froze just for a second there.
Okay, what was the last thing that came through? Okay, so one of the advantages from a regulatory perspective of going this direction is that by the time you get to de novo, the FDA has already seen and cleared the core of your technology. And it's almost like putting blinders on, and you can say, hey, you just cleared this over here. There's no need, to re-review our software, re-review our hardware or electrical safety if none of that has changed. Just stick to this clinical data. So those are a couple of things to think about in terms of time and cost and regulatory strategy of what a pathway could look like. So that's just a very basic level of some regulatory considerations. Now let's look at how that rolls up into life science investing and startups 101. So I see this all the time. As investors, a lot of people think that, okay, the company has a great pitch, all the financial projections look great, the device concept makes sense, and the company is confident in their own regulatory strategy. That's all you need to be successful, right? Well, wrong. From a regulatory perspective, that's very, very wrong. And we'll talk about some reasons why. the biggest one is that a pitch deck is just a story that the investor is telling. And that can be a fictional story or a non-fictional story. You know, and every startup thinks that they're telling a non-fictional story, but they may or may not know. So I see oftentimes companies are in love with their own science, and that they think that it's so logical and intuitive that the FDA is going to be in love with it too. And the FDA, I can tell you right now, does not believe in the transitive property in math. They do not believe if A equals B and B equals C, that A equals C, unless you do all of your work in between to prove that A and B are equal and B and C are equal. They are not going to make that assumption and apply that what you think is obvious and fundamental logic conclusions. We all are painfully familiar with the inventor-led company where they're also trying to wear all the hats and be the CEO and not surrounding themselves with the right team. And then also, you know, the inability of a company to compromise the product offering based on a combination of marketing and regulatory strategy. I see companies thinking that they can do the regulatory research themselves. And for regulatory people, regulations can be both underestimated and overwhelming. We just saw all the combinations of exemptions, and I rarely see a company that appropriately interprets all of those configurations that apply to it and what its quality management system and submissions need to be. And underestimating them can jeopardize your company's compliance. If you're overwhelmed, it's going to slow you down and impede your success and your path forward. A patent does not equal design controls. I see companies all the time that think, oh yeah, my product's fully designed. We have a patent and it's issued. But design controls are actually a process that's specified by the FDA in what's called the quality system regulation. And it involves all these iterative steps that you see here. And it's a life cycle where even when you go into production, it feeds back into the design. Companies do too little, too late. They have ideas. Should be the normal progression of things. You have an idea, you have your market validation, first prototype, so on. And this is where a lot of companies call me. They call me at this, we need it now. And the reason why they wait right until they think that they're ready for an FDA clearance or approval to call me is that the companies think, well, this sounds expensive. Regulatory sounds like expensive. It's necessary evil. I'm just doing this to get through the FDA. Well, the problem is the time you should have a regulatory strategy and a testing strategy is between that period of your idea and your market validation, because your first prototype, you need to know what your testing strategy needs to be, because that's going to affect your design. And if your prototype can even pass its required minimum safety testing. Lastly, you need to think about when's the right time for a pre-QMS and that design control we just talked about, because if you don't do all of these things at the right time, you're going to have to get in your time machine and build these things retrospectively, because I need all of these things that come out of a healthy design control process and testing strategy to put into a FDA clearance or approval. And retrospectively building these things, especially under a constrained timeline, really is expensive. So in the regulated world, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. As investors, you need to think about, I see software companies come to me all the time that have not one lick of paperwork documenting their software design and development, but they think they have a product with nothing for me to turn in terms of documentation to the FDA. And I realize that documentation is the bane of a software company's existence, but the FDA is still document-based. Vice versa, if you didn't do it, don't document it. They call that falsification. Some other common mistakes I see that you can be aware of that companies make and ask these questions is that they under communicate. They don't submit a pre-sub at all when they should have, when there's important questions to ask the FDA for concurrence on, or they over communicate and they submit pre-subs to the FDA, multiple pre-subs, but they didn't like what they heard, so that they're not incorporating it into their submission strategy or their device design. I also see companies that look at their competitors and that they assume, especially when their competitors might not have done a submission, that their competitors did their diligence correctly, or that they're understanding their exemptions correctly and haven't exceeded them. I've also seen companies think that they know the such and such secretary of whatever, and that they'll just make a call to the FDA and bully the FDA into getting their product approved. Also know if your company requires a contract manufacturer, that does not absolve you from the requirements of a quality management system. It does narrow the scope, but there still is many sections of the quality system regulation that you will be responsible for, and you can't outsource the ownership of your product. Unsubstantiated claims saying that you're twice as fast, you're better than, you improve outcomes, all of those things have to be substantiated with data. Many times those claims need to be submitted to the FDA depending on their scope, particularly if they have to do with an intended use. It could lead to reclassification, or it could also lead to a letter from the FDA saying that you're misbranded or unsubstantiated. So I have found that it's much better to ask for forgiveness, ask for permission rather than forgiveness with the FDA. In pitch decks, be on the lookout for regulatory language that's not cohesive with a regulatory strategy. If you hear the words novel, new, first of its kind, those things are not equivalent to 510K. If a company's saying, hey, we're class 2 510K, it's going to be a straightforward regulatory path, and then they're also rattling off this new novel technology features, those are a de novo, which literally means of new, and that you won't have a predicate for those things. So the 510K relies on you having a predicate where you claim substantial equivalence. So for startups, this is a constant battle because you're trying to convince the USPTO that you are so new and novel that you deserve all the patents you applied for. Then on the other hand, you have to turn around and put that story on its head and convince the FDA that you're not, and implement all these things, at the right time. Also, given that you need to implement your design controls at the right time. So questions that you should ask founders when you're doing your due diligence. When is your planned exit? Is it before or after the regulatory approval or clearance? What is your regulatory path? Is it 510K, de novo, PMA? Ask what their predicates are and double check the reality of those predicates, because the FDA is going to look feature by feature to know what path these things fit into or eligible for. So why do you think that's an appropriate path? Ideally, the answer would be because we met with the agency on such and such date and they confirmed our strategy. So who is your regulatory consultant? Why did you choose them? Who's on your regulatory team? Who on your team has regulatory expertise? And why do you think that? I see companies all the time that not only do they not have staff, which most companies won't have a regulatory staff, they don't have a properly qualified regulatory consultant either that's providing their strategy, and they've done the research themselves. Last but not least, this is my favorite right now. What geographies are you going to? If somebody tells you we're going to the EU first because it's easier, run away. Don't even bother arguing with them or trying to convince them what their regulatory strategy should be, because with the medical device regulations that went into effect in full May of this year, or we're in 2022, May of 2021, this effectively ushered in a paradigm shift in go-to-market strategy. In the past, the FDA was known for requiring rigorous clinical trials, being a little bit more of a pain to get to market, and everybody was going to Europe first because of the ease of entry. Well, as of May of last year, those paradigms have completely shifted underneath the requirements of the new regulation, and even long-standing medical technologies like wound drainage catheters, nasal cannulas, you name it, are going to have some level of clinical study, if not full out rigor, and extreme cost by the third-party assessors, up to 6 figures for a single technical file review. So more questions to ask the founders. Does your products make a claim? What evidence do you have, or do you plan on supporting that claim? Is your product prescribed or OTC? And be aware of the play where they say, we have a consumer play and a healthcare play, and they're throwing out that novel 510K term. Here's an example of one that was a sweetheart for investors for a while. Owlet Baby Care, they made socks that could monitor all kinds of biometrics about your baby. And they said, oh, this is just for consumer use, but we have a healthcare play. And then they had this other product that they wanted to sell into NICUs and whatnot, but they didn't stay very hard in their swim lines. When I showed you all of those differences between digital health and how the product could be otherwise classified, they went a little bit too broad with their claim set, and they ended up with a warning letter from the FDA and had to stop selling their product. Market clearance is not the end. That's when the real work's beginning. You have to have a full quality management system, and there are regular activities that you have to do within that system to stay compliant, and the FDA can inspect you at any time. So it's really up to the company if they're going to have a marriage made in hell or a marriage made in heaven, determining how they have viewed FDA and their regulatory strategy, if they've made it a necessary evil, or if they treated it like the FDA is going to be a strategic business partner. So that's it for my presentation. I'll take questions now. I've got several handouts on my website, including a regulatory pathway assessment, which is where I start projects that are kind of at the due diligence or early idea stage. And we also have a business market assessment about how to analyze, particularly for the EU market, if it makes sense to bring your product there from a financial perspective or not. So that's me. I'll take any questions now.
All right, thanks, Michelle. That was great. So please post your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. There are a couple of comments in the chat box I'll kick off with. First is a comment, thanks to Nanone, that it's important to determine that FDA cleared intended use and if it's reimbursable. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yep, so regulatory and reimbursement go hand in hand, but they are two totally different specialties. I don't do reimbursement, but it is important for you to understand, at least at that base level, what your strategy is going to be. And if you fit into a existing code already, and if so, will what they pay for that code be appropriate for what you're going to commercialize your device for? Or if you're going to have to go and either ask for a new code altogether because there's not one, or if you're going to have to ask for some exception to an existing code.
Great, thank you. There's another question in the chat box. If you could, can you define the term that you said for export only with regards to the approval process?
So for export only, or for devices that are made in the United States but not intended for commercialization in the United States, you still have to register with the FDA as an establishment and tell them what you're making and that you are exporting it.
Okay. Can you give us a sense of, I know this is a crazy question, well, apologies to the person that posted it. It's not crazy. All questions are good questions. Can you give us a sense of the time it takes and the cost associated with getting a 510(k) approval?
Yeah, no, that's not crazy at all. In terms of 510(k) fees, if you file, and this is something else you need to ask, depending on when a company is telling you that they are going to file their 510(k) or their de novo, they need to apply for what's called the small business determination 60 days at least before the date they want to file, because the FDA gives you a discount on your filing fees. For a 510(k), that's right around $3,000 in cost for a 510(k). And I think this year it might be around 28 for a de novo. Whereas for, if you don't have it, it's in the vicinity of 12 or 13,000, and I think 123,000 for a de novo. That's just the FDA fees. In terms of time it takes to like actually author a submission after you have all of the data that somebody like like me would need. So you have all your test data, everything done. It's right in that 80 to 100 hour or so range for a 510(k), and 150, 200 plus for a de novo, depending on the complexity.
Thank you. And when I said crazy, I meant because there's a wide range of responses, but that's very helpful. The next question I had is, you talked about the right time and the right place for companies. Do you have any advice on how they can put their strategy together? What steps they need to take to understand, really the right time and right place?
I think one of the most important things is the predicate strategy, and understanding in depth how you differ from that predicate device, because that's going to determine if you're going to fit in the 510(k) path or if you're going to require a de novo. Also, it's never too early, in my opinion, to have that regulatory pathway assessment done, because all I need to be able to figure out about your planned product. So you do need to know the intended use and a high level outline of the technology. But if I can figure out what product code that you reasonably fit into, I can help you understand all those configurations of exemptions and requirements, and also what it's called a recognized consensus standard may apply to your product, which is going to outline your test requirements and your test strategy. So all that can be mapped out very early.
Great. Do we have another question in the chat box? How much does the regulatory pathway assessment cost?
I typically perform those for 15 hours plus or minus 5 hours, depending on the complexity, how many intended uses, how much technology, how much algorithmic things are we trying to incorporate, would be on the higher end of that. If it's something a little bit more straightforward, a class 1 that we're not sure where it fits in the exemptions, that'd be on the lower end. So just a fun example. I'll keep taking questions here in a second, but I've got a new client that thought that they had read the instructions for themselves, and understand, or the regulations, and thought that they understood that they were a class 1 510(k) exempt, except for they made their product, they added software to their product, and the original regulation does not cover. It's like very basic technology, very basic hardware, no software, and they made it for home use, and the regulation does not specify that it could be for home use. So a friend of me went to the FDA and said, "Hey, FDA, do you really think this fits into this class 1 510(k) exempt?" And the FDA says, "No, as a matter of fact, we do not. That exceeds what we intended by the exemptions." Then they got a nice letter from the FDA that asked them, that says, "Okay, in this instant, we're going to allow you to keep selling your product, but you're going to have to immediately put in a 510(k) and immediately put in a quality management system for a class 2 product, or you're going to have to recall your product."
Good comments. Other questions? You're welcome to post them in the chat box or raise your hand. I have more. All right, so I'd like to follow that thought, Michelle, too. You mentioned software, and earlier you talked about that. Can you kind of describe a little bit more about the best approach for a software company?
To just stay up, first off, you need to know ISO 62304. That is the international standard for software development. There is also a half dozen newly released guidance documents. While they're in draft, they reflect the FDA's current thinking about how they want to regulate software. And you need to be aligning your development strategy accordingly, or you will not have the documentation in the format that I need it to turn into the FDA. The FDA requires is more clear about the documentation they want to see for a software device than almost anything else. And I see time and time again, you know, like I said, software is the documentation is the bane to the software developer's existence. I see, and the agile process too, is that at some point you have to be able to put a stake in the ground, and what is effectively going to be a document for me to use in a submission needs to come out. So if your software companies aren't familiar with those things, there needs to be some real base level education that needs to happen.
So maybe a follow-on question to that for you and also the other investors that are on the call. You know, what level of material and detail are you looking for as an investor when you're doing diligence on a company in terms of their regulatory strategy?
I think just by asking the questions that I outlined and some of these like little tips and tricks, and just keep asking questions. If something doesn't make sense, ask another question. There's likely a reason it doesn't make sense, and it may not be because you don't know about that regulation or whatever. It might be something that just doesn't make sense from a strategic perspective. And once you start asking questions, you'll get a feel for where they're at in that maturity model. And then also, you know, to pay somebody like me to do a regulatory pathway assessment, you know, at 15 hours isn't a huge investment if you're thinking of dropping, you know, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars into a company. So Eric's asking, does a breakthrough device status improve the odds of that the FDA will clear a product? Very technically, it is supposed to be a collaboration between the FDA and you to facilitate that process, and where you have you don't have to go through like all the normal hoops and formality of that of the normal pathways with the regulations. Like for instance, instead of maybe doing multiple pre-subs, you should be able to collaborate with whoever your team is at the FDA. They're supposed to negotiate endpoints and maybe biomarkers and different things to help not only the process through the FDA, but, you know, again, negotiate endpoints that would mean that you could get into the market. Now, one thing you need to know about breakthrough is that there's a fairly new program that's about 2 years old. It's called Safer Technologies. Now, everybody wants the breakthrough because they want to say that they're breakthrough. At the end of both that and the step process, the FDA, you know, releases a press release that says the FDA partnered with so-and-so, and we worked together to come up with a treatment for childhood autism. I don't know. That was one of them. But the criteria for the breakthrough is very stringent in terms of mortality, morbidity, and impairment, and on the level of novelty that has to be there. Whereas the Safer Technology says yes, maybe other technologies exist to treat this, but this is going to have such a better outcome for the patient that it's safer than or an improved risk benefit profile.
Eric, did that address your question? Michelle, earlier on your slide, one of your last slides, you had a link to your website, and I think you had a couple of documents noted. Can you point me in the right direction, and I'll put it in the chat box?
Sure. It's of course it's not going to crop right now. Did it stop sharing my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Here, I'll put it in there. So another fun fact about that client that got the letter from the FDA about their class 1 device, the doctor, the inventor founder, said this can't be that hard, as you know, because it already wasn't that hard for him to interpret the regulations wrongly, so it can't be that hard to write a 510K. So he wrote his own 510K with no help or support, which got stuck in the refuse to accept policy process, because he told the FDA, these are long-standing materials, therefore I don't need biocompatibility. Oh. No. That's a classic. And so that's another warning sign. If you hear people telling you that this or that is a long-standing material or a long-standing this or that, the FDA and especially the EU, they don't buy justifications anymore.
Nanon, you were laughing. Do you have a comment you'd like to add to that? Anything you'd like to share with the class?
Can you hear me, by the way? Okay. So I'm president of Patsam, which is a medical device company. And we had a predicate, very, very similar, same materials, the whole 9 yards. And the FDA made us do a clinical in order to submit a 510K. And we thought it was going to be much easier path than, as Michelle is smiling, we thought it was going to be a much easier path. The other thing that really surprised us was that we had done a peer-reviewed A-journal clinical studies that went through and were published in A-journals, and we quoted what was in the publication and put an asterisk by it that we were better. Or that we had improved outcomes, and supported by hard data, and the FDA came through and they made us take it down. And which is, you know, I'm not going to fight with the FDA because I will lose every single time. And also our disposable device, which has now been FDA cleared, was under review. So when do you not want to pick a fight with the FDA? I think the answer probably is never. But it is really incredible that what's published in journals with hard science and it's peer reviewed doesn't matter to the FDA. They don't care if they haven't given you the exact wording. Then
if you want to say that bad, do you want to go through another submission that bad? You know?
Well, we are, and yeah. Actually it took 3 pre-sub meetings at the FDA to get the path forward to have claims of superiority. But we did say our device is designed to. So Michelle knows all about those games to play too. It is a much harder road, and also the quality is a very difficult. Of all the things, the quality management system is very difficult, and if you don't have that in place, not only do you get in trouble with the FDA, but your probability of flipping your company is going to be much more difficult. So quality systems are just really, and we scaled to production. So you have drawing updates, all those have to go through your QMS. It's very hard, and we farmed that out, and I'm really glad we did.
That's a great point, and about that it also affects your ability to get acquired. I get hired to do diligence by companies that are buying other companies regularly, and so it can vastly affect a deal value if I find anything that is out of sorts in what should have been the ongoing quality management system, and the complaint management, the complaint reporting, in the claims on the website versus what's in the 510K. I mean, there's a whole number of things that could affect the value of a company in the sale. So it's not just, when you should care about these things isn't just when you're investing at other stage, but care about the health of the company, as long as you're an investor in them, and make sure that, they're being, responsible as a medical device company, and not just, a lot of the wild west, and not wanting to invest in maybe a regulatory or quality person in-house, or a consultant, or trying to DIY it.
Well, Michelle, I have a question about the EU. I mean, it's to get a CE mark, is, from what I've been told, is virtually, it's not happening. And if you do, it's like 200. It's incredible. When do you see? And I know what happened with the problem with the notified body that made all these changes happen. When do you think that pendulum is going to swing back? Because it just seems like new products are not getting into Europe.
The only where I see it's going to be companies that started afterwards and never knew the difference in what the cost or the pathway was under the medical device directive versus what it is under the medical device regulation, and planned and raised money up front for those costs, which it still might be cost prohibitive. But if you think about anything that's truly not new and novel, it's going to need some level of clinical trials, even here in the United States. So I think devices that fall underneath the de novo path, that have basic clinical data that can just be expanded for whatever the EU is going to want to see out of that data, are going to be the most successful in Europe. But a traditional 510K device that does not require clinical data is not. It's going to be a real struggle to bring it to market. And I'll just give you a kind of a story of a client who has, it's a small to mid-sized company. They do emergency care products. They have intravenous interosseous IV. So it's got a little manual drill. It drills right into the bone, and you put an IV in the bone instead of a vein. Commodity product. They've been selling it for 40 years. They've been selling it in Europe forever. And it's a silicone tube with a needle and a driver, basically. And their notified body started from scratch, as if they've never seen this product before. And they went through rounds of review that cost, in notified body fees, $100,000, and took a year. And at the end of a year, and at the end of $100,000, they still didn't have their sterility and biocompatibility queries back from the notified body, because they kept losing their sterility expert. And so they finally pulled the review, because they had no idea how much more time or money in just those third-party fees it was going to take to keep their product on market.
And can you, like, if a startup company got a CE mark, is that CE mark transferable to the acquirer or not?
No.
They have to go through the process from scratch?
Yep, that's considered a significant change. A significant change to the change in management, change in quality management systems. Yeah. They're also not friendly to virtual manufacturers anymore. So, your company is different because there's so much more of a transparency with your relationship. But like a lot of relationships where maybe they're the specification developer and they've given their specifications to the contract manufacturer. They want such a level of detail from the contract manufacturer that they're unwilling to provide because it's proprietary. Things in process parameters, in process validations, in processing aids, like there's all kinds of data and details where the EU is also trying to kind of limit what they've termed virtual manufacturers.
All right, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. And there is one in the chat box from one of our members, Dick. Are there regions of the world where approval process is expedited?
You know, there's still some of, you know, the African countries and Latin America and South America where the regulations are ambiguous if they exist at all. There's also, if you get the 510K in the US, that you'll be recognized in a lot of other markets with that, vice versa in the EU. Let's see. You know, if you want to go after what's called the MEDISAP, Medical Device Single Audit Program, that is one audit that, at least for your quality management system, not for your product approval, will cover you for Japan, Brazil, the US, Australia, and I am blanking on the 5th one. Anyhow. So, you know, still the US approval process gets you in a lot of places, just not Europe. So, you know, my other ask is, you know, as you guys are looking at deals and, you know, to kind of take what you've learned here, and if you hear other investors saying wrong things or doing wrong, you know, or advising a company incorrectly, like, you know, hey, 20 years ago, I had a great exit in Europe. Why don't you do that? Well, 20 years ago, Cauldron wants its regulatory strategy back. It's not a thing anymore. So maybe gently share the education so that a company doesn't go off and reinvent their regulatory strategy.
Good comment. I get those calls from 20 years ago all the time. Any other questions or comments for Michelle? Now's your chance, especially for those of you thinking about putting your regulatory strategy together. All right, hearing none. Michelle, any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us? Maybe your top 1 or 2 takeaways?
You know, you all will get the slides afterwards. Just study those questions, and they might not seem intuitive at first, but you're going to get a gut feel. All of you have a lot of intuition already. Ask those questions, and you know, you'll start to recognize when things don't sound right or feel right based off of just this little bit of education. And then also the safer technologies. So yeah, so that's what I was talking about. So Eric just put in there, can Michelle speak a little bit about the safer technologies program? So it's the safer technology evaluation program. And that's the one I was mentioning when he was asking about the breakthrough. And that's where, whereas the breakthrough, you have to have a more serious level of mortality, morbidity, impairment. It has to have a certain criteria for novelty. The safer technologies can be maybe something already exists out there. Maybe mine's a little bit more novel, but not enough to meet the criteria of the breakthrough, but I am safer or better than, but maybe not breakthrough, but it has a similar benefit. So, but yeah, so just be educated in your due diligence. You guys can do more than you think with the knowledge that you have. And then, you know, call me or somebody else, you know, to help you out if you're going to put any significant chunk of change into something.
All right, good advice. We do need to do our diligence. Jeff and Jeff are smiling at that, I'm sure, because we can always do more due diligence as we're looking at these opportunities. So thank you so much, Michelle, for your time today. This was really helpful and great. I took a lot of notes. We'll provide the slides and the video to our members later. And if you have any questions or comments, please post them in the chat box. I'll linger here for a few minutes. Thanks, Michelle.
You will automatically.
It's funny, people are lingering.
Love it.
I love it. Yeah. Good discussion. Thanks, Dick, for putting your camera on. I called out your name when I asked the question, and I thought, it is him, right? All right, I'm going to turn the recording off. Thank you, Michelle.